All right, the next part that we're going to look at is the course learning outcomes and mapping them to your graduate attributes, AQF, and threshold learning outcomes and accreditation bodies if required. So on the spreadsheet here you can see that the course learning outcomes are there and they've been mapped across. So what that looks like is, now these have come across from the benchmarking, but if you're not doing benchmarking, then you are actually filling them in here and you're doing those adjustments right now. So as you put in your, in this instance it would have been 11, then you're going to go back and you're going to start looking at the policy and making sure that these actually cover what they're supposed to cover in the policy and that you have 10 or less. Once you've done that, then you're going to map them to the graduate attributes. Now, in the past, you had one course learning outcome mapped to one graduate attribute. That's not the case anymore. The graduate attribute should be mapped to as many course learning outcomes as they actually map to. So you will see that in this instance, the first two are mapped to 1, that's mapped. This one's actually mapped to 2, this one to 3, that to 1. So as we've gone through, we've mapped them to the areas that they actually map to. And you might need to read these graduate attributes from the Southern Cross site so that you get a better understanding of what they actually cover. So once that's been mapped, then we're going to move on and we're going to map them to AQF. So this is AQF 7, and so up here there's specific things that they're asking for AQF 7 people to map to. And what you're doing is there's no formula on how to best map it. You really have to look at what you have written. So this says apply critical analysis, reasoning, and flexivity to social and cultural situations and problems. So we're going to read this knowledge, skills, application. And so here we have analyze and evaluate information to complete a range of activities. So we have a critical analyze, generate, and transmit solutions. And so here we have, cultural situations and problems, so that would map here. So these are the two areas that we can map that to. So you really just have to read it and you have to look at the intent of what this is saying and then the intent of what these are saying and map it to the best that you can map them to. And that's why it's good to do this with a few people so you can get like those opinions of how those translate to each other. So once you've done that, you have that mapped, then what you'll do is you'll have your threshold learning outcomes. Now in this example, the Bachelor of Arts actually goes across multiple ones, and so what we've done here is the Bachelor of Arts actually has a lot of specializations or majors, and within each one of those there actually is threshold learning outcomes for each of those majors, and so we've put it there and mapped it there. But for instance, in science, Bachelor of Science, it has threshold learning outcomes for the Bachelor of Science, so they would go right here. And so you would do the same thing. You would fill those in, however many there are, and you would map these across to make sure that you have everything covered in the threshold learning outcomes. Now if you get to a point where you're mapping across these and you have areas that you just can't map to, then you're going to need to go back and revisit your course learning outcomes because they should be able to map across these. This is the industry standard and you should be able to cover them with those course learning outcomes. You'll also then map to regulatory bodies or accreditation requirements if you need to, and again, if you put all these in here and you have some you can't map to, you're going to need to go back and look at your course learning outcomes. Remember, it's an iterative process. Just because you have them in there doesn't mean you have them right the first time. So if we actually look at our instructions, you'll see that we have AQF and graduate attributes. Here we have links to where you can find threshold learning outcomes, and what's covered is in this area right here so that you can see where you need to go. And in some instances, you might have threshold learning outcomes and professional accreditation, but most of the time it's one or the other. So here's an example of threshold learning outcomes being mapped. And you would, take your course learning outcomes, map them across. So this is in science. And there's some explanations there on how you would map. And then here is an example for industry regulatory competencies. So here they have it separated by knowledge and skill base, engineering, application ability, and professional and personal attributes. But your regulatory bodies will probably have them different. So basically you'll pop them in here in whatever format you need it to work, and then you'll map it to your course learning outcomes. And again, they should be able to map to all of them because you have to cover all of these accreditation requirements within your course learning outcomes, so you should have them covered across. And you'll notice that many institutions don't have a lot of course learning outcomes. They'll have somewhere between 6 and 8, which is why we're saying 10 or less, and they're able to cover all of their regulatory requirements, threshold learning outcomes. So it's possible. You don't have to have 20 course learning outcomes to cover them all. You just have to think critically about how you word them. All right, so once we've done that one, we'll move on to the next tab in the next video.